Hello everyone, welcome to another very exciting tutorial. This tutorial is actually a bonus episode for our parallax and animation scrolling effects. So let me show you what we're going to achieve today. I'm going to refresh the page. You'll see that some text coming up, and then when I press next, you'll see that we have this cool 3D animation. I go next, we're going to have this, and then ultimately we're going to end up right here. So today I'm going to cover how to create this 3D animation effect. I'm not going to cover the animation that happens here, but I will definitely put the link of this prototype in the description section. You can go ahead and see how I managed to do it. But if also on requests, if you wanted me to do a tutorial on how to create this part of it, please comment in the comment section below. So without further ado, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please go ahead and do. As always, we're gonna have really awesome tutorials coming up. So let's get started. As always, I'm going to kotus.com in the front end section, and I usually use our online front end editor, which is an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript editor, more or less like CodePen. So for the starter, I'm going to create a container for the whole page. And then within the container, I'm going to define another div with the class board container. And this is where the actual 3D effect happens. And within this board container, I'm going to put a div with class boxes. So this will include basically are two boxes that I showed in the demo. Within that, I will create one for the base board. So I'm going to give it a class board, and then I'm going to put another one called chip, which is the small square that we had. So if I want to show you in the demo, so basically the board is going to be the gray one over here, and the chip will be this small one down there. So now I'm going to go ahead and style them a little bit. So for the uh, board container, which contains our 3D space or the fake 3D space, I'm going to give it a width of 100 VW and then height of 100 VH. They both stand for viewport width and viewport height. And then I would go ahead and give it a perspective of 2000 pixel, and this is where the magic happens, right, by defining a perspective value. So if I go ahead and change this to this layout so that we both have the markup and the CSS, so we added a width and height of the viewport and then assigned a perspective 2000 pixel on this one. Now for the boxes, which includes the actual um, the actual rectangles or boards, I'm gonna set the width to be something like 400 pixel and height of 600 pixel. Then I would just say let's give it a background just to show you where we stand here. So this is gonna be the container. So I'm just gonna remove it for now. And the next thing I want to do is add the styles for our board. So I'm going to give it the same width and height as its parent. So width 400 pixel, height of 600 pixel, and then I'll give it a background of CCC that I use in the demo. And then the next thing I want to do is basically center it in the container. So center the board in the boxes container. Uh, you can see that the width and height are the same, so it's not 100% necessary to do that. But since I'm going to assign the position absolute, I also go ahead and use left 50%, top 50%, and then I would just use, because we have defined them with the fixed value, I can use margin. So I'm just going to use margin minus 300 pixel and then minus 200 pixel. Well, you can see it centers here, not within the container that we defined. The reason being that I have to set the position on the boxes. So I'll go ahead and put the position to be fixed here. So now you can see that it ends up in the place that we wanted. Now I wanted to have a little bit of a border from top and left. First things first, I need to set the body margin to be 0 so that we don't have any margin around the body. And then on the boxes container, which contains the board and chip, what I'm going to do is maybe because I positioned it fixed, I'm just going to say left 10 pixel and then maybe bottom 10 pixel as well. As you can see in the demo, it's actually quite on the bottom of the page, and that's how I set it there. So going back to the layout here, you can see it even better. So the boxes is now position fixed, and then we have the board, and now I need to add our chip. So for the chip, I'm going to use also a default width and height of 100 pixel and height of 100 pixel. I also position it to be absolute. Give it a background color of maybe blue violet for now so that we have a color for it. And then I would set the top to be 50%, left to be 50%, so it ends up somewhere there. And since I have defined the width and height to be the fixed value in pixel, I can use the margin minus 50 pixel and it will center itself within the container, which is boxes, right? So now we have the initial markup. Um, the next thing is to make it basically oriented like this. And to be able to do that, we need to add a class in style in their parents, which is boxes, which is going to be transform style preserve 3D, right? Just like that. And now I'm going to give some transforms to the actual boxes class that we have. To be able to do that, I'm just going to say, okay, let's give the transform. Now you can see that I have perspective and this has the transform style preserve 3D. Now if I go ahead and say rotate it on x-axis 45 degree, you can see that it kind of has a very nice effect on the 3D space. So the x-axis is from left to right of the page, so it rotates around that. The next rotation I want to add is Y. So rotate Y on Y-axis the same degree, so 45 degree. Now we have this. And then ultimately, I want to add a rotation on the Z-axis. And in that sense, I want to give it minus 30 degree, right? So now you can see that we pretty much have the same orientation as we had in the demo. So we started by rotating the parent boxes, which includes the board and chip, by 45 degrees on X, 45 degrees on Y, and then minus 30 degree on the Z. And this is pretty much a value that I sort of came up with by some trial and errors to kind of match it to be positioned right over here. So all right, pretty good. So the next thing I want to do is to have this effect, right? So it comes a little bit up and then the other one, the board goes down. So to be able to do that in the CSS, I'm going to say if, so I'm going to say board dot first. Let's say the first class is the one that translates the board uh, down, right? So to be able to do that, I can easily say transform, translate Z, because the Z axis is right now going through the boxes. And if I give it a negative value, it means that I go sort of further away from the camera, which is supposedly in front of these. So it goes down. And if I choose a positive value for translate Z, you'll see that it comes up. Let me show you how. So if I choose, for example, translate Z, let's give it minus 150 pixel. So this is the board first, and then I need to add one for the chip. So chip first, I'm just gonna translate it instead of 150 pixel negative, I'm gonna set positive 100 pixel, right? Obviously, we need to define some transition so that we see the transition. So I'm just going to say transition all, maybe 2 seconds. And then for the chip as well, I'm just going to say transition all, and then 2 seconds as well. So now we have our base classes. The next thing I'm going to do is add these buttons that we had up here. So in my HTML, in the container, I'm just going to define a div with class nav, put two button, one for previous. So I'm just going to say prev, and I'm going to copy it and put it for the next as well. So now we have next. In the CSS, I'm going to style this a little bit. So nav, I'm just going to set the position to be fixed and then give it a top of maybe 20 pixel and right of 20 pixel. You can see that the buttons end up over here fixed in the page. And then also I'm going to style the buttons a bit. So button, I'm just going to give padding, maybe top and bottom, 10 pixel, 20 pixel from right and left. And then I would remove the border, maybe give a background of a dark color, and then maybe give the color of white, and then supposedly give a border radius of 3 pixel. Yes, so it looks pretty okay. It's pretty much like the one that we have in the demo. So now the next thing I want to do, now that I have defined the classes that I want the next, for example, when I click on next, I want to apply the first both on the board and for the chip. So what I can do in JavaScript, I can define a reference. So next btn, I'm going to say document query selector, and then my next class. And then I also need to have a reference to both of these elements here. So let's say const board equals to, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. And then here I know that the class is board, and then I also need one for the chip, right? So now the next thing I want to do is add a click event listener for next btn. So add event listener and then click. Second argument is going to be a function. I'm writing this using arrow functions in ES6. And then I simply just go ahead and show you what happens if I add the class first. So add first both to the board and then the same for the chip, right? So now if I press next, you'll see that we have this cool animation. And this is how I simply apply. So when we play next, we're going to add the first to both board and chip. And for the board, it's going to translate minus 150 pixel in z-axis, which is going down. And then for the chip, it's going to go 100 pixel up. One thing I did to add a little bit of a visual effect to this is added a shadow so that it looks a little bit more realistic. So in order to do that, what I did was I basically created a div and I called it shadow. And then this shadow has the same size of chip. So what I can do here, and I can say the shadow, I want it to be the same, but also I'm just going to define some preliminary styles for the shadow. So I'm just going to give it a background color of maybe something like AAA. For now, I'm just going to set the chip to be display none so that I can show you what I'm doing with the shadow. So this is our shadow. Maybe even darker color, maybe 666, something like that. And then I also add a class first to the shadow, which means that when I click next, I want to see the shadow to have some other effects, which is I'm going to use filter. I add a little bit of a blur to it, maybe 10 pixel, and then maybe change the opacity to be 0.7. At least that's how shadows usually work. So now if here I come and also get a reference to the shadow like that, so I'm just going to say shadow, wait a minute, shadow, and then also here shadow, and I just give the class first to the shadow, just like that. And in my CSS, I'm going to remove this class that I defined. So now, if I press next, you'll see that this effect happens. But obviously, we want our shadows to stay on the board, right? And to be able to do that, we need to, in the CSS, when we apply the shadow on the first, we need to give the same translation as the board, right? So that they follow the same translation. So now let me save this. You'll see that when I press next, we're going to get a better effect, kind of more realistic effect, right? As if like it really goes up. So this is the first thing that I need to do. Now I can show you a new trick, or a trick basically, that you don't need to use all of these, references and adding these classes. I know that in my CSS, the order that I have over here is board, and then the next sibling is shadow, and the next one is cheap. What I can do in CSS, instead of adding classes like, board first, cheap first, shadow first, I can give the board first, like that. And for the shadow, which here in my HTML is the next sibling of the board, what I can do, let me just copy this and just to preserve the order a little bit. Here I can do board and then with the class first, because these first classes apply to all of them, and then I would remove this and then use plus in CSS. So basically what happens is that when we apply the class first to the board in JavaScript, it will also apply this one on the shadow, which changes the blurriness. And we can use the same technique for the chip, but since in our HTML chip is after shadow, what we can do here is say I can use board with the class first, then shadow, and then our chip, right? Just like that. So now if I show you from scratch, you will see that we kind of get the same effect, right? So this is the first. The second thing is when we press next here, if I show you in the demo, if I press next, you will see that this goes a little bit higher and this goes a little bit more down. So now it's super easy, right? The next thing we can do is we can just assign a new class called second. And then here, I'm just going to transform it even more on the z-axis. So I'm just going to say maybe minus 300 pixel here for the board class, just like that. And then for the chip and shadow, so I'm just going to copy these as well down here. And then for the shadow, I'm going to say, because the distance is going to be a little bit higher, maybe I will increase the blurriness a little bit more. And then opacity, I'm going to make it a little bit less. But also the translate should follow the same translate as the board, because the shadow is going to stay on the board. So I'm just going to say this. But for the cheap, I'm going to translate it a little bit more, so 200 pixel, so from scratch. Now, we need to sort of in JavaScript keep track of the first and the second. So if I change this to be correct as well, so second. Now what I can do in JavaScript is define an index. Let's define an index 0, right? Now, as you can see, since I use this kind of syntax to apply the first class, I can just get rid of, in JavaScript, I can get rid of the shadow and chip. And then I simply just need to apply the first two and the board class, and then the CSS will take control, and then it will apply those to the shadow and this box here as well, which we called it chip. So now what I want to do is when I click on the next, I want to increase the index by 1, and then check if index is equal to 1. I'm just going to apply the first class. Otherwise, if the index is equals to 2, I want to apply the second class, right? Just like that. So I'm just going to say second here. Now if I play this, when I press one time on next, we have this effect, and if I press again, you'll see that we have this effect, which is pretty cool. And ultimately in the demo, what happens when I press next, you'll see that it orients and it looks like it's not in 3D space anymore, but it really is. We just changed sort of transformation on the boxes, right? So to show you how I'm going to do it, I'm just going to define a sort of a um, reset class as well. So here I'm going to say boxes dot reset, because if you remember, what we did was we applied these transformation on the boxes. Now we want to sort of reset that so that everything is 0 here, right? So the rotations on all the axes are 0. And also the next thing I want to do is I want to use the same technique. So if it's reset, I want to reset the board to have transform. Since we use translate Z, I want to make that also reset to 0. And the same way for the chip. So I'm just going to say board. And then if you remember, we had this syntax. So I'm just going to say shadow. And then the next element is the div with class chip. And I'm just going to say transform, translate Z. And then I'll set this to 0, right? And finally, since we added the class reset on the boxes, I need to have a reference to that boxes. So I can just simply copy this and then say boxes and then boxes here as well. And then here I would say else if index is equal to 3. Now I want to apply the class boxes, the class reset to the boxes. So boxes dot class list dot add and then reset. And ultimately, when I apply this reset to the boxes, you can see here that when I apply reset to the boxes, it will affect the board. So it resets the translate to 0. And also it will affect the chip as well to set the translate to 0. So let's see what happens. If I press next, we're going to have this and then this. And then if I press one more time, you see that we had this effect. The reason why it didn't work, because initially we don't have any transition property on the box itself. So if I come here and set the transition to be all and the same duration, now if I play it again, so next, it goes here. If I press next again, it goes here. And ultimately, if I press next, you'll see that we have this cool transformation. So now how about prev button? It's pretty much the same thing. It's as easy as simply, let me define the prev reference as well. I'm just going to copy the next and paste it here. I'll call this prev. And then the class that we have for that button here is is prev. And then I can just say prev btn dot add event listener. And then here I just say click, and then the second parameter, the function. And here I just do index minus one, minus one, which decreases the number of index. But then we should do the same thing here. What I can do is extract this piece of code and go create a new function. I'm just going to call it transform. And then here I'm going to paste this piece of code so that I can call this transform in both of these handlers. So I can press transform here and then I can call transform over here as well. So now if I press next, we're going to have the same effect, the same effect, and the same effect. Now if I press prev, you can see that it does what we asked, but not correctly. So if I press previous, you see nothing happens really. The reason why nothing happens is because we initially added these classes to the board and boxes. And what we need to do is we want to make sure that we reset and remove these initially. And to be able to do that, I'm just going to create a function just to show you what I do, what I say. So reset, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to say, okay, I'm going to, during the transition, when I click next, 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 I'm going to add all these classes. Now I have a reset function that will remove all these classes, and then when we call this transform function, it will apply the right class to them, right? So I can just simply say board.classList.remove first. So it basically removes all those classes that we applied. So second, and then we also have one for boxes. So I'm just going to say remove reset here as well. Now, every time I call transform, I just want to call this reset function first, right? So that it removes the classes that are applied in the previous iterations and then applies the right class. So now if I press next, you'll see that it works correctly. The next page and then the next page. Now if I press previous, you can see we have this very cool effect, and then we have this, and then we have this, right? I especially myself, in the original tutorial, I didn't do the previous button, but if you notice here, when it goes to this stage like that, I really like the way when I press previous, this transformation happens. It's actually pretty cool. I would definitely use this in some of my upcoming projects. So regardless, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As you could see, we covered a little bit of a 3D and how we apply how we sort of set up our markup, and then the application of perspective, and also the transforms on three axes that we have over here, and definitely the transform style that I apply to the parents of the things that I want to translate on z-axis. Yeah, so that's about it. I'm gonna put the link to this prototype as well as the actual prototype that I have over here. Again, if you had any questions, go ahead and ask it in the comment section, and stay tuned because next tutorials are going to be awesome as well. So I wish you a great day and night, and see you next time. Goodbye.